I smiled when he said it. Not a nervous smile, not the kind you put on when you don't know what else to do. A real smile, the kind that comes from somewhere deep in your chest when you realize that everything is going to be perfectly fine. My name is Raymond Hollis. I'm 64 years old. I lived in a weatherboard house in Ballarat, Victoria. 3 bedrooms, a veranda out the back, and a garden my late wife Maureen spent 20 years turning into something beautiful. Roses along the fence, lavender under the kitchen window, a lemon tree she planted the year our son was born that now reaches the guttering. I retired 2 years ago from 31 years working as a structural engineer for the council. Not a glamorous career, but a solid one. Maureen passed 6 years ago, breast cancer, caught too late, and since then it's just been me, the house, and the garden. My neighbor Frank calls it my therapy. He's not wrong. I have one child, a son. His name is David, and I love him more than I've ever loved anything in this world except his mother. That has never changed. Even after everything that happened, even after the night he stood in my own kitchen, looked me in the eye, and told me to get out. Let me go back to the beginning, because that's the only way this makes sense. David was always the bright one. Scholarship to Monash, engineering degree. Then a graduate position at a firm in Melbourne that did commercial construction projects across the Asia Pacific. He was 26 when he met Priya at a work function. She was a project manager, sharp as a tack, always immaculately dressed, the kind of woman who remembers every detail of every conversation. I liked her well enough in the beginning. She was confident, driven. She made David happy, and that was what mattered to me. They married when David was 28. Maureen had been gone 2 years by then, and I think neither of us quite knew how to navigate a wedding without her. But we managed. I gave a speech about how Maureen would have adored Priya, and I meant it at least. I meant it then. The trouble started quietly, the way trouble usually does. About a year into their marriage, David's firm restructured. His whole division was folded into the Sydney office, and rather than relocate, David took a redundancy package. It wasn't a disaster, he had savings. Priya was still working, but it knocked his confidence badly. He went from being this assured, capable young man to someone who second-guessed everything. He applied for positions, had interviews, but nothing came through. The market was tight. Months went by. It was Priya who suggested they come and stay with me in Ballarat while David sorted himself out. She framed it practically, why pay rent on their apartment in Richmond when they could save money and David could take his time finding the right position? She said, 6 months at most. I said, of course. He was my son. Where else would he go? That was 5 years ago. I want to be fair here. The first year was genuinely fine. David helped around the house, fixed the guttering, resealed the driveway. Priya cooked dinner 2 or 3 nights a week. She was an excellent cook. I'll always give her that. We had routines. Sunday breakfasts together, Friday evenings watching the football. It felt in some ways like having the house full again. After the silence of the years following Maureen, it was a comfort. But somewhere in the second year, things shifted. I couldn't point to a single moment. It was gradual. Like the way water gets into foundations, you don't see it happening, and by the time you notice the damage, it's already done. Priya started making suggestions about the house. Little ones at first. She thought the lounge room furniture was dated. Could we rearrange it? She wondered if the back bedroom might work better as a home office for David. She mentioned, just in passing, that the kitchen could really do with a renovation. I went along with most of it. It was just furniture. It was just paint. Then she started having opinions about Maureen's garden. She said the roses were high maintenance, and maybe we should replace them with natives. She said the lavender attracted too many bees, and she was worried about guests. What guests? I never understood, since we rarely had any. One afternoon I came home from golf with Frank to find she'd cut back Maureen's climbing rose along the back fence. Not trimmed it. Cut it back hard, to almost nothing. She said it was getting too big. I didn't say what I wanted to say. I went inside, made a cup of tea, and sat with it until the feeling passed. She didn't know what that rose meant to me. I told myself she didn't know. In the 3rd year, David found work. Not the senior role he'd been hoping for, but a project coordinator position with a mid-sized firm in Geelong, about an hour's drive away. I was relieved, genuinely relieved, because I thought it meant they'd look for their own place. But Priya said the commute was manageable from Ballarat, and the property market was impossible right now, and it just made financial sense to stay a little longer. David nodded along. He always nodded along with Priya. I noticed, by that point, that David rarely disagreed with her. Not on small things, not on large ones. When I raised something gently, carefully, David would listen, seem to consider it, and then do whatever Priya had already decided. It was like watching someone slowly hand over the controls and then forget they ever held them. My friend Frank, he's been my neighbor for 18 years. We play golf every Tuesday and Thursday without fail. Frank started noticing things before I let myself. He'd see how Priya spoke to me at the gate, the tone she used. Not rude exactly, but dismissive, like I was slightly inconvenient. He mentioned it once, and I brushed it off. He didn't bring it up again, but I caught him watching sometimes, the way a good friend watches when they're worried but they don't want to push. By the 4th year, I had largely retreated to my bedroom in the evenings. The lounge room had, by degrees, become Priya and David's lounge room. The television was tuned to what they wanted. The thermostat was set where Priya preferred. My books had been moved from the shelves in the hallway to make way for their things. I found them stacked in boxes in my bedroom without anyone mentioning it. When I came down to the kitchen for a glass of water one night, Priya said, without looking up from her laptop, "Could you try not to bang the cupboards? We're trying to work." I was 62 years old. It was my house. I had lived in it for 27 years, and I was being asked not to bang the cupboards. Still, I said nothing. He was my son. They would move eventually. I had patience. What I didn't have, it turned out, was enough patience. It was a Tuesday morning in late autumn when everything changed. I know it was Tuesday because Frank and I had just come back from golf, and I was still in my good shoes when the conversation happened. Priya was working from home that day. She'd moved into a senior operations role with a logistics company by then. Substantial salary, good benefits. David was in Geelong. It was just the two of us in the house. She called me into the kitchen with the tone she used when she wanted to be taken seriously. I sat across from her at my own kitchen table, and she slid a piece of paper toward me. It was a property appraisal. For this house. She said they'd been thinking about their future. She said the house was underutilized, 3 bedrooms for one person was inefficient. She said the market was strong right now, and if I was sensible about it, I could downsize, free up the equity, move somewhere more manageable, something more suited to a man my age. I looked at the paper. Then I looked at her. I asked her what she meant by more suited to a man my age. She said, pleasantly, that she just meant something smaller, low maintenance, maybe a unit. There were very nice retirement communities in Ballarat. She understood. I was 62. Maureen and I had bought this house at 35. My son had taken his first steps in this hallway. There were pencil marks on the door frame of the back bedroom, measuring his height from age 4 to 14. Maureen's lemon tree was in the backyard. Her lavender, what was left of it, was still under the kitchen window, and my daughter-in-law was sitting at my kitchen table suggesting I move to a retirement community. I picked up the appraisal, folded it in half, and handed it back to her. I told her that when I wanted to know what to do with my house, I would let her know. Then I went outside and stood in the garden for a long time. I called Frank that evening. He listened without interrupting, which is something I've always valued about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Ray, you need to talk to David." I knew he was right. I'd been avoiding it because I didn't want to put David in the middle, didn't want to make him choose. But Frank was right. This had gone past the point of quietly hoping things would sort themselves out. I drove to Geelong the following Saturday and took David to lunch. Just the two of us, at a pub near his office, where he used to take me when the project he'd been on finished and he wanted to celebrate. Over a counter meal and a beer, I told him carefully, without anger, what had been happening. The garden, the furniture, the books, the retirement community conversation. David listened. He was quiet for longer than I expected. Then he said he hadn't realized some of that had happened. He said Priya had mentioned the house being underutilized, but he hadn't known she'd actually spoken to me about it. He seemed genuinely surprised. And then he said, and I've turned this moment over many times since he said, "Dad, she's not wrong that the house is probably more than you need." I put down my fork. I looked at my son. I asked him if he was serious. He backtracked quickly. He said that wasn't how he meant it. He said he just meant practically speaking. He said he was sorry. He wasn't handling this well. By the end of lunch, he was apologetic and warm, and he drove me back to my car and hugged me in the car park and said nothing like that would happen again. I want to believe he meant it. I think part of him did. But nothing changed at home. The 5th year was the hardest. Priya had stopped pretending to be warm. There was a coolness that had settled over the house like a season change, a functional politeness that never softened into anything real. Meals were separate more often than not. The Sunday breakfasts had quietly disappeared. David was tired from the commute, from work, from, I suspected, the ongoing effort of being caught between two people he cared about in different ways. Maureen's photograph had been on the sideboard in the hallway since the year she died. It was a big one. In a silver frame, her sitting in the garden at Christmas, laughing at something out of frame, the way she always laughed, with her whole face. One morning I walked past, and it was gone. In its place was a small succulent in a ceramic pot. I stood there for a full minute. Then I went looking. I found the photograph in the top of my wardrobe, wrapped in a tea towel. I sat on the edge of my bed, and I held it, and I thought about what Maureen would say if she could see what had become of her house. I thought about the kind of woman she was, generous, but clear-eyed, with no patience for people who dressed selfishness up as practicality. I thought she would have sorted this out a very long time ago. That night, I called Frank again, and I said something I'd been avoiding saying out loud. I said I thought I needed to protect myself legally. He agreed immediately. He said he'd been wondering when I'd come to that conclusion. He said his nephew was a solicitor in Ballarat property and estate law, and he'd give me his number. I rang the solicitor the following week. His name was Andrew Prescott. Young fellow, very thorough. We had a long conversation about the house, about tenancy arrangements, about what rights a property owner has, and what obligations. I hadn't charged David and Priya rent, it was my son. The thought hadn't occurred to me, which, Andrew explained, actually gave them fewer legal protections than a formal tenant would have, but it also meant I had limited paper trail of any formal agreement to terminate. We talked about a few options, and then Andrew mentioned something that made me stop and ask him to repeat himself. He said that given my age and the circumstances, it might be worth considering whether I had ever thought about transferring the property into a trust structure, with clearly delineated terms about occupancy and inheritance. He said, some people in similar situations found it gave them peace of mind, not because they expected conflict, but because it removed ambiguity entirely. I went home and thought about that for 3 days. Then I called Andrew back and said I wanted to proceed. The process took about 6 weeks. I didn't tell David. I didn't tell Priya. Frank knew. because Frank drove me to two of the appointments and sat in the waiting room reading a fishing magazine while I signed things. The house was transferred into a family trust. I was the sole trustee and sole beneficiary during my lifetime. The terms of the trust were explicit. No other person had any claim on the property or right of occupancy without my express written consent, and that consent could be withdrawn at 30 days' notice. Andrew said, when it was finalized, "You've done the right thing, Raymond. I hope you never need to use it." I hoped so too. That was 8 months before the inheritance. I should explain the inheritance, because without it, the rest of this story doesn't quite make sense. My older brother Keith, we were never close. He moved to Perth when we were in our 20s, and we spoke at Christmas and birthdays, a cordial distance more than a real estrangement. Keith died in February, without children, without a spouse, and without, as far as anyone knew, a will. The public trustee became involved. It was months of process, letters, forms, a solicitor I'd never met sending me documents at irregular intervals. What emerged, eventually, was that Keith had done rather well for himself. He'd bought commercial property in Perth in the 90s and held it. When he died, he had assets of approximately $2.3 million. As his only surviving immediate family, I was the sole beneficiary of his estate, $2.3 million. I sat with Andrew Prescott when the final figure was confirmed. I was, I think, in mild shock. I'd known Keith had done all right for himself, but I hadn't known the extent of it. Andrew was calm and businesslike about the whole thing. He saw large figures regularly, and we talked through the implications carefully. I did not tell David and Priya immediately. I needed to think. I needed to understand what I wanted to do with it, what it meant for how I lived, what it meant for the house, for Frank, for the future. Frank knew, because I told him that evening over a beer on his veranda. He congratulated me genuinely, then sat quietly for a while, then said, "Ray, what are you going to do about the situation at home?" I told him I wasn't sure yet, but I was thinking about it. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that Priya had already found out. I don't know exactly how. I believe she overheard a phone call, or perhaps saw correspondence. I was not as careful as I should have been with the letters from the solicitor's office. However it happened, she knew the number. And the moment she knew the number, everything shifted. The coldness in the house dissolved overnight. Suddenly, Priya was warm again, warm in the careful, deliberate way she had been in the very beginning, back when they'd first moved in. She started cooking meals again. She asked me about my week, about my golf, about what I thought of the roses she'd been considering replanting. She laughed at things I said that weren't particularly funny. David seemed lighter too, following her lead the way he always did, as if a decision had been made somewhere he wasn't fully aware of. I watched all of this, and I kept my face neutral, and I said the right things in response. But I watched. It was a Sunday evening, about 3 weeks after Priya had clearly found out that the conversation I had both expected and dreaded finally happened. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, a dinner Priya had cooked, a nice one, lamb chops and roasted vegetables, and she said, in the bright, reasonable voice she used for important announcements, that she and David had been thinking. They felt it was time to make some longer-term plans. She said the house was wonderful, but perhaps wasn't quite right for the life they were hoping to build. She said they'd been looking at properties. She showed me listings on her phone, houses in Geelong, a couple in Ballarat, spacious, modern, and they wondered if the equity in this house, combined with what they understood might be coming to the family, could help them get into something that worked for everyone. For everyone. I asked what that meant. Specifically, David said they'd been thinking I might enjoy a change of scenery too. Maybe a move closer to town. Something easier to manage. There it was again. easier to manage, more suited. I asked them if they meant they wanted me to sell this house, combine the money with the inheritance, and purchase separate properties, one for me and one for them. Priya said, well, something like that. Though it would depend on how the numbers worked out. I looked at my son. He wasn't quite meeting my eyes. I told them I'd think about it. They seemed satisfied with that. Priya touched my arm when she cleared the plates. I went to bed that night and lay in the dark and thought about Maureen. I thought about the pencil marks on the doorframe. I thought about the photograph that had been in the top of my wardrobe for 4 months. I thought about 5 years of gradual, steady encroachment, the garden, the furniture, the books, the rose. I thought, no, not this house, not this way. The following morning I called Andrew Prescott. He already had everything prepared, because I had asked him to prepare it 3 weeks earlier when I first suspected this conversation was coming. We met at his office that afternoon. I signed what needed to be signed. Andrew couriered a copy of the trust documents to a second solicitor in Melbourne, a woman named Patricia Malone who specialized in estate disputes and came highly recommended, and Patricia agreed to be on standby if needed. I also, on Frank's very practical advice, had a locksmith come and change the locks while David was in Geelong and Priya was at a work conference in Sydney. I had the locksmith replace the locks on the front door, the back door, and the side gate. I had new keys cut 2 sets, one for me, one that I gave to Frank for safekeeping. I was ready. I should have expected that Priya would escalate quickly. I should have, but I underestimated her confidence. It was a Thursday night, 10 days after the Sunday dinner conversation. David was home. I'd had dinner in my room, something I'd been doing more often again, and I came down around 9 for a cup of tea. They were both in the kitchen. Priya was standing at the bench and David was at the table, and there was a quality to the silence when I walked in that told me this had been planned. Priya said they needed to talk to me about the house. I said all right, and I sat down. She said they had been doing some research. She said that as long-term occupants of the property, they had certain rights under Victorian tenancy law. She said that because I had never asked them to leave and had in fact invited David to stay, they had established occupancy rights that would be difficult to challenge without significant legal process. She placed a printout on the table in front of me. I looked at the printout. I looked at her. I looked at my son, who had gone slightly pink and was examining his hands. I said, "Is this what you want to do?" David said quietly that they just wanted security. They'd been there 5 years. They had lives here. They deserved to know where they stood. Priya said that if I wanted them to vacate, I would need to follow the proper legal process. And given the circumstances, and here she paused, given the circumstances, it might be simpler for everyone if I just agreed to what they were proposing. Use the inheritance to help them purchase a property outright. Their names on it. A clean solution. I was 64 years old, and my son's wife was sitting at my kitchen table explaining to me that the price of getting my own house back was my inheritance. I was quiet for a moment, long enough that Priya looked slightly uncertain. Then I said I had something to show them. I went to my bedroom. I opened the drawer in my bedside table. I took out the folder Andrew had prepared, the trust documents, the certificate of title showing the property held in trust, and a 1-page summary Andrew had written in plain language, specifically for this occasion. I brought it back to the kitchen and put it on the table. I said, "This house was transferred into a trust 8 months ago. I am the sole trustee. The trust documents contain an occupancy clause that gives me the right to terminate your right of residence with 30 days written notice, regardless of duration of occupancy, because your residency was never formalized as a tenancy under Victorian law. The tenancy protections you're describing don't apply to your situation." I slid the summary page toward them. Patricia Malone's contact details are on the back of that page. She is a solicitor in Melbourne specializing in estate disputes. I've already briefed her. If you'd like to challenge the trust structure, you're welcome to call her. The kitchen was very quiet. Priya picked up the page. She read it. The color in her face changed in a way that was almost interesting to watch. David said, "Dad, when did this happen?" I said, 8 months ago. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said because I had hoped it wouldn't become necessary. And then I said, "David, she put your grandmother's photograph in the top of my wardrobe." He looked at me. Then he looked at Priya. She didn't say anything. I stood up. I said I was going to make my cup of tea, and I'd like them to take a few days to think carefully about what they wanted to do next. I said I loved my son and that hadn't changed and wouldn't change. But I said this was my house. It had always been my house, and it was going to remain my house. Then I put the kettle on and waited for it to boil. Priya left 3 days later. She packed 2 suitcases and left in her car in the morning without saying anything to me. I heard the door. I didn't go down. David came to my room that evening. He sat on the end of the bed where he used to sit when he was small and had a bad dream and needed to talk to someone. He was 36 years old and he looked, in that moment, about 12. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't understood how far things had gone until he saw his mother's photograph. He said he'd told himself it was just practical decisions, just logistics, just Priya being efficient. He said he'd told himself a lot of things. I said I knew. I said I didn't blame him for all of it, but I needed him to understand that some of it he had done himself, and that was something he'd have to think about. He nodded. He didn't argue. He stayed another 2 weeks, looking for a rental. I helped him find a decent flat in Geelong, near his work. I drove him there on a Saturday and helped him carry boxes up the stairs, and at the end of it, we had a pub lunch together and talked about football, and said nothing about any of the rest of it, which was exactly right for that day. He calls every Sunday now. We talk for 20 minutes or half an hour. Sometimes he comes to Ballarat for dinner, and we sit on the veranda and I tell him about the garden, and he tells me about work. He hasn't mentioned Priya except once. Briefly, they separated formally about 2 months after she left, and he seemed more relieved than heartbroken, which I thought told its own story. Frank came over the week after David moved out and we replanted Maureen's climbing rose along the back fence. He brought a good established plant from the nursery, same variety. A Cecile Brunner, small pink blooms, vigorous grower. We planted it in the same spot where the old one had been cut back. Frank is not a sentimental man as a rule, but he brought his good gloves and he didn't rush it. When we were done, we sat on the veranda with a beer and looked at the garden in the late afternoon light. Frank said, "You doing all right?" I said yes, genuinely. I said, "I thought I was." He said, "Maureen would have sorted that out in about a week." I said I knew. He said, "Took you 5 years, but you got there." I said that was fair. I've done a lot of thinking since then about what went wrong and why I let it go as long as I did. I think part of it was grief, not just for Maureen, though that was always there, but a kind of grief for the family shape I had wanted. I wanted the full house. I wanted Sunday breakfasts and the sound of other people's lives. I let that wanting blind me to what was actually happening. I think about the parents who open their doors out of love and find themselves, slowly and almost imperceptibly, pushed to the edges of their own lives. I think about how it happens not all at once, not with shouting, but quietly, incrementally, with the language of practicality and common sense. Something more suited to a man your age. I know now, and I wish I had known sooner, that love and boundaries are not opposites. That opening your door to someone you love does not mean surrendering the door itself. That being a generous parent does not require you to make yourself small in your own home. I know that legal protection is not a failure of trust. It is, sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself, and even for the people you're protecting yourself from. Because without it, you leave everyone in ambiguity. And ambiguity is where resentment grows. I know that the friends who sit in solicitors' waiting rooms reading phishing magazines while you sign documents are worth more than anyone who arrives when circumstances become convenient. And I know this. The pencil marks are still on the doorframe of the back bedroom. I've measured them. They go from 4'2" to 5'11", age 4 to age 14. 32 years of a boy becoming a man. I will never paint over them. This house holds everything that matters to me, and it is mine, and it is staying mine. Maureen's rose is already putting out new shoots. I smile when I see them. A real smile, the kind that comes from somewhere deep in your chest when you realize that everything is going to be perfectly fine.